the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. My name is Tom Luongo, and we have a lot to talk about. This is episode 41, and we've reached the book-burning stage of the Cultural Revolution in the U.S. The next stage of the purge from social media of dissident voices began with the banning of Molyneaux, and it reminds me of some cautionary tales from filmmaker Christopher Nolan. I was rewatching The Dark Knight Rises over the weekend, and the film made so much more sense to me, given the light of current events, than it did before. And I'm going to explain to you why that is, but first I want to remind you that you can follow my work over at my blog at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. Live streams, they happen every Monday night at 8 p.m. and every Friday night 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on both YouTube and DLive.tv, which I will be making more central to my live streaming going forward, given the state of affairs at YouTube. Warning, I'm a bad boy, I've got a potty mouth, and I use those words in sentences. You can also support the podcast by downloading and installing the Brave browser. Now, Brave protects your online privacy while blocking all those pesky data snoopers, the ads, and the tracking cookies, which feed that growing surveillance state. You know, YouTube. Moreover, you can earn crypto tokens called BAT for opting into Brave's ad network and use them to tip your favorite content creators who, like me, are verified publishers on the network. Be it a favorite website, YouTube, Twitch, or SoundCloud channel, click the Brave logo icon to the right of your search bar to tip your earnings and directly support the content you love through those earnings. They are like YouTube Super Chats, but without Google taking their 30% cut. Lastly, you can join the more than 400 people who support me directly on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns, where you can sign up for the twice-weekly market reports covering current events and the technical state of important markets. Or you can sign up for the Gold, Goats, and Guns monthly newsletter, which ties up all the cultural, geopolitical, and economic shifts and trends into a coherent portfolio strategy designed to help you make a sense of a world going completely mad. All right, a little eulogy here, but ultimately, the banning of Molyneaux from YouTube was as predictable as water being wet and the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. This has been on the ticket for the last 4 years now. I remember going back to 2016, early 2017, there was a document that was going around talking about Alex Jones and all the people who were related to him and how they were going to go down the entire tree of those people, kind of like a 6 degrees of separation from Alex Jones style, to ban and marginalize all of those people. And Molyneaux knew it was coming. It doesn't make it right, but he knew it was coming. So at the end of the day, I'm sure that Stefan has moved himself. I know he's over on Minds. I know he's over on BitChute. I'm sure he's over on Locals with Dave Rubin and other platforms such as that, and that's fine. Ultimately, I think YouTube is destroying themselves, but hey, whatever. What you have to realize here is that all of the social media companies have aligned themselves with the DNC and with the oligarchy that is trying to remove President Trump from power and scuttle Brexit and all the rest of it in order to move the center of Western power from Washington, D.C. and New York City to Brussels and or Frankfurt. They'd like it to still be the city of London, but they want it to be within the confines of the European Union. The European Union is the new California. Every bad idea these oligarchs have will start with the European Union because there's no democratic process for creating new rules, regulations, and edicts. The European Commission says something and it happens. It becomes rule. And the European Parliament has a nominal rubber stamping process or discussion process. But at the end of the day, they don't make any legislation. They don't make any of the rules. That comes from the EU's Politburo and the people who stand behind that. When you look at that, knowing that all the social media companies like Facebook, like Google, like Twitter, and the rest of them are all aligned with the DNC here in the United States to destroy the United States and move the center of power to Europe, once you realize that they're pot committed to that and the removal of President Trump from office is a linchpin in this, because otherwise they're going to be opened up to all manner of legislation, regulation, and attacks from a second-term Trump Department of Justice, which for the most part he's getting under his control under Attorney General William Barr. If he wins, they're in trouble. So they're pot committed now. They're not going to be acting fairly. They're not going to even put up the pretense of acting fairly. So if he wins, this is going to be peak social media of the entrenched type that we currently have that dominates the NASDAQ 100. Facebook, Twitter, Google, and the rest of them. Anything that helps him needs to go. And Molyneaux, in his own way, is a symbol of that, and he's part of that process, and him and other people. And this tells me that the people who are doing this are just on autopilot. This has just been a plan, and they're just executing the plan, bit by bit, point by point, but they're still fighting 2016's war in this sense. right? They just look at 2016 and go, well, we lost the thing because of social media. At least that's what they think. And therefore, they're going to try and control social media in order to try and win 2020. Most generals are always fighting the last war. They're never thinking ahead. One of the few in this process is George Soros. He does think ahead. He does think in terms of, how do I lay the foundation for the future attack? He's very good at this. He's actually an excellent strategic thinker. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him ultimately irrelevant. But what does any of this have to do with Christopher Nolan? What does this have to do with me watching The Dark Knight Rises over the weekend and having some great insight? Well, let's get into it. Marxists are going to Marxist. They're going to be who they are. And at every stage in this process, it's going to become a cult mentality that takes over and turn radicalized kids into true believers and turn them into shock troops. I've been talking about this for weeks now. This is part of the process, and they've been building this since Occupy Wall Street started in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008. And Nolan's Dark Knight Rises speaks to this directly. So, here's a movie in 2012 that is kind of presaging what we're living through in 2020. So last night I started talking about some of these things on my live streams that I do on Monday nights. And I blatantly told my audiences, look, I'm going to use y'all as guinea pigs tonight because I'm just starting to put these ideas together. So I was watching the movie the other night. So I'm going to run these ideas by you and we're going to go with it. And we'll see where we are. And what came out of that was great. I got a great comment from one of my regulars on YouTube who said about Nolan's first movie, Memento, which was the movie about the guy with no short-term memory and was cut in this very non-linear fashion, which I, by the way, hated. And I'll explain why in a minute. What Memento is saying is that what if every generation forgets hard-fought lessons previously learned, then laboriously tries to reconstruct a rational, quote-unquote, reality from deceptive fragments? Trusted sources have no moral integrity. That's what Memento is talking about. My problem with Memento at the time was purely structural, and I'll explain why. That movie righteously angered me. I was all the way with it. I was on board with it. It's the kind of movie that tickles all of my intellectual capacity. I love movies and stories that break the fourth wall in some way, that know their text, that are winking at you in a certain way. That's a form of postmodernism. And I love that method by which to tell stories, but only human stories. I don't like manipulation of the text for the purpose of manipulating the text to tell everyone just how nihilistic and absurd living in this world actually is. So when we get to the final shot of the movie, which ends exactly the way it begins, and now unpacks this onion in such a way that the whole thing is just one big story about a psychopath serial killer and all of these people that who have been traumatized by this man, and we thought who were traumatizing him, it all turns on its head. That, to me, felt like the cheapest form of emotional manipulation for no real effect. And I still feel that way about Memento, even after thinking about it in the context of all of my re-evaluation that I've been doing of Christopher Nolan over the last 72 hours. I still feel like Memento is a mistake, and I'll explain why later. So before I get to The Dark Knight Rises, I need to explain some very important stuff about who I was before I became a political and economic analyst. Because from the time I'm like 13 years old and I start really looking at stories and I read my first Philip K. Dick novel, I become a rabid consumer as an artistic mind for the next 17 years, really, until my early 30s. And I start delving into libertarianism and I start delving into the kind of spiritual awakening that happens when you bring the non-aggression principle in as a kind of foundational principle doctrine for your life, searching for the best writers who used all these iconoclastic techniques of breaking the fourth wall, but to tell powerful stories of redemption and of the human triumph and human spirit and all of that. And my first and favorite of all of these, what I would call humanist postmodernists, are people like Philip K. Dick, Franz Kafka, Jorge Luis Borges, Grant Morrison, even John Fowles in The French Lieutenant's Woman. Roger Zelazny's Amber novels are also incredibly powerful from this perspective. All of Stephen R. Donaldson, the Thomas Covenant books, the Gap books, Mordaunt's Need, all of it. Everything I've read by him, and I've read almost everything he's written. I mean, short stories like Reeve the Just and others are just unbelievably heartbreaking, brilliant, beautiful pieces of postmodernist style literature. where you've got an unreliable narrator, or you've got a text that literally breaks the fourth wall in the case of something like Grant Morrison's Animal Man. And I was really thirsting for this stuff. And it was important to me to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so I've been weeding out the writers that embody that ideal while pruning out the Marxists, finding those guys while pruning out all the Marxists, all the anti-human postmodernists like Sartre, Camus, and given where I spent most of my time reading, Alan Moore, who wrote Watchmen, V for Vendetta, and others. And I love V for Vendetta in many ways, the comic book, but I despise Watchmen. I've come to despise Watchmen as a story over the course of time because I feel it is a classic example of form over function, form over purpose. It is like Memento, a story trying to tell a human story. Well, I think Memento is trying to tell a human story and does it badly, while Alan Moore is fundamentally trying to tell us in Watchmen that humanity is terrible, and it's a nihilistic tale of horrible people. And so, to me, these writers that I've curated for myself, the good ones, use the idea of the living text as a tool to tell great stories, to tell great, archetypally brilliant, beautiful stories about the human condition and to help us get through chaos. They're not conclusions. The anti-human postmodernists say life is absurd. They show you that life is absurd, and they stop there. They're 13 years old. They all have a 13-year-old criticism of Christianity or any religion. And I mean that sincerely. Even the 13-year-old version of myself. But to the great ones, to the Philip K. Dicks and the Grant Morrisons and the Rogers Lasneys and the Stephen Donaldsons, these are means to tell human stories, and the living text or postmodern breaking the fourth wall is used to reflect our growing dystopic society, especially Philip K. Dick. He was brilliant at this. It's every one of his great books. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Follow My Tears, The Policeman Said. Ubik, The Man in High Castle. All of these books, they all do the same thing. They use these conceits, these means of questioning reality and questioning the narrator and all of that to tell you kind of metatextually that the world we live in is an insanely dystopic one. It's very similar to what T.S. Eliot was talking about in both The Wasteland, now that I think about it, and the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, even Preludes. Those seminal poems were doing exactly the same thing. They were presaging the rise of the next generation of post-World War II American writers, who then saw the dichotomy and the inconsistencies, the internal inconsistencies of the American empire as it was being built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so it's brilliant stuff. And to me, that's what's fascinating. And people like Alan Moore, who's just a British Marxist, which, by the way, they're the worst kind of Marxist, use the tropes to damn humanity to hell because they just feel life is absurd. And while the struggle is fascinating and is interesting, it's ultimately pointless and irrelevant because, we're all just going to die anyway. So this is why I still feel that Nolan's use of the nonlinear storytelling in Memento undercut the human tragedy of the story. It's why I was so angry with it when I first saw it. I'm like, oh my God, if you just I've been saying this for 15 years. If you just told the story that you have, it would have actually been so much more effective because it felt like he was undercutting his story and it felt like Marxist nihilism. And from that moment forward, I was very suspicious about Christopher Nolan, especially him taking on Batman, who is a character I absolutely adore because I feel that Batman is an incredibly important archetype for the 20th century. The type of hero, he's a very 20th century style hero, style archetype. Batman, I think, is actually quite one of the most important evolutions of the archetype. Nolan's use of that narrative trick felt like cheap Marxism. And God, guys, who has time for more cheap Marxism from Hollywood? I mean, I watch it everywhere. You wonder why I don't like the Marvel movies? Because it's everywhere. It's pathetic. And even good ones that, can't overcome the fundamental, Stan Lee-ness of all these freaking origin stories. Even like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, which I like, but I still have to grit my teeth about the whole, with great power comes great responsibility thing. And he's the Marxist Untermensch who's going to help the downtrodden and the proletariat and from his Brooklyn apartment. It's all, it's like straight out of Comintern, for Christ's sake. The whole Spider-Man thing. So I have a real complicated relationship with it because at times they tell good stories within that context, but then remember always where its roots come from. So my relationship with Nolan is complicated because he kept inserting leftist tropes, especially environmental disaster, into all of his movies. And Memento had me really worried about his true purpose. I couldn't tell where he stood. And while it's not important that an artist tells you what his political leanings are, it is important when you start to delve into movies that he makes that are intensely political. And the Dark Knight trilogy is absolutely intensely political. So while I love The Prestige and I love The Dark, I was very wary of Nolan. And then when we got to The Dark Knight Rises and the politics became truly overt, post-Occupy Wall Street and all the rest of it, it really colored my analysis of the movie. And I never really grokked it. And I was very resistant, very hesitant to it. And then he came out with Inception right after that. And Inception felt underbaked, like an underbaked and superficial interpretation of Philip K. Dick's seminal book, Ubik. That's a no-no to me, because Ubik is something very close to my personal Bible. It's a very important book to me. It's my favorite novel. It's an incredibly important text. It says so many very important things. It's a book with true layers of reality and true layers of meaning embedded all through its very short runtime, for lack of a better term. I wondered about him. And so while I loved The Dark Knight and I loved The Prestige, I had to wonder, was this a detour for Nolan? Because Alan Moore wrote Watchmen, and while I despise Watchmen because I understand what Alan Moore is doing, I love so many things about it. And one of the great things about Watchmen is that the story is so powerful, and the narrator of that story, Rorschach, is so powerful that it actually undermines Alan Moore's original intention. I'm not going to go into that because that would be a terrible digression, but just understand that the character in Watchmen that Alan Moore, the writer, hates the most, Rorschach, is the most human character in the story. Now, that should say something about Alan Moore's view of humanity, certainly. But Rorschach is the character we all gravitate to because he's the moral center. And sometimes, if you're a good writer, you can't help it, right? You can't help but allow your story to come to its conclusion, even if that's not what your intended purpose for the story originally was. So Nolan could have been doing that with those earlier films, especially The Prestige. So we've got Inception. I never did watch the environmental nuttery that is the inciting incident for Interstellar. I just couldn't bring myself. Christopher Nolan trying to do Stanley Kubrick. Like, that to me is just one step way too far. And what I've come to realize now is that Christopher Nolan truly is a guy reaching for the next great. He's always trying to work right outside his grasp. And I should respect that. But again, all of this stuff has been going around in my head with him for years because I don't trust him. And here's the midpoint turn of the podcast. I was completely wrong. Memento was a film school project. I just watched a recent interview with Nolan where he interviewed George Lucas about the making of Star Wars. And you could see how much Nolan loved Lucas's work and how much he respected George Lucas and how important Star Wars was to him. And it's something I didn't know. And so it was very obvious to me that Memento was Nolan's homage to THX 1138, Lucas's first film. When you view it from that perspective as a film school project, and you look at the rest of Nolan's films, most of Nolan's films are an homage to all the people who he loves, all the filmmakers who he adores. And I could do an entire podcast on this, and I'm not going to. But just understand that that's what I reacted to. Had he done what I instinctually feel would have been the better choice to serve the story, had he told Memento properly, as in the linear narrative, it would be an even better movie than it is today. Okay, that's fine. So rant off about that. But he was an artist trying to tell a cool story, and he was too clever by half, which is, oh, by the way, one of the things that gets him into trouble. His reach, his appetite is bigger than his stomach. His eyes are bigger than his stomach. That's fine. Artists should reach for that. We have so few artists taking any chances at this point. I should give Christopher Nolan every opportunity to dazzle me. I'll be honest with you. And I've been kind of wrong about that. Because let's look at The Dark Knight Rises now, which I think might actually be his masterpiece. But I think The Dark Knight is just a better movie because the Joker is a more compelling villain and foil for Batman than Bane/Talia al Ghul. But let's talk about this. So the whole setup for the entire trilogy is that the movie is a cultural clash between Bruce Wayne, a Lord of Order, against the League of Shadows, who embrace chaos as a way of advancing society. And Ra's al Ghul talks about this directly in Batman Begins. It's the whole purpose of destroying Gotham for that reason. But at the end of The Dark Knight, Bruce built a false order on a lie. He'd killed organized crime, but he'd allowed the institutional crime to continue, that of effectively Wall Street, the big-moneyed oligarchs, and actually gave them an even greater playground because organized crime wasn't there to snipe at their heels. No longer was the mob a problem. Batman cleaned that up, but that wasn't the real problem. The system itself is flawed. The political superstructure, the societal superstructure for lack of a better term. That is what was wrong. The movie keeps telling us over and over and over again what happens when the system fails to protect the innocent. This is John Blake's arc. This is what happens when the system fails to protect people, which is why we have to have that during the climax. He brings the kids on the bus to the bridge, and the army blows the bridge because they're so scared that Bane will blow up the city if anybody crosses the bridge, because they don't know what's going on. This is the world we live in today. I mean, this is a beautiful metaphor for the whole COVID-19 Karen meme that we have to blow up the friggin' economy to save 50 people from dying in a hospital. It's the same thing. It's fear driving you to do terrible, terrible things. Damn people to death because you can't take responsibility for anything. So the institutional crime, that syndicate, as exemplified by John Daggett, thought it could go as far as it wanted to, and it was going to use Bane to consolidate its power. So Bane, the mercenary, coming in to bring to John Daggett Bruce Wayne's company, Wayne Enterprises, and take it over. That was his goal, because if he did that, then he would be able to consolidate even more power and have more control over the world. Well, Bane comes in with all his mercenaries and has bigger plans, which is to destroy Gotham City. So the order that was built is at best metastable. It was built on a lie and the use of ruthless force by the local government, which is a direct homage to Rudy Giuliani using RICO in every way imaginable to clean up organized crime in New York City when he was district attorney. Let's not ever forget that. And this is very subtle and sophisticated analysis by Nolan and the way he's built this story. He understands the dynamic here. And it's almost like, I'm almost ashamed to admit that I missed all this the first time through. Bane and Talia al Ghul are trying to bring forth Ra's al Ghul's plan to destroy Gotham City, which is the peak of our society, and reset the entire system. And that order will somehow come out of the ensuing chaos. Now, when Ra's would have been alive, it would have been his order. He would have been in charge. Talia and Bane don't have future plans. They're true believers, and they were willing to die. They were in Gotham City, ready to die to allow the bomb to go off and destroy the city and kill 12 million people. They didn't have a plan. What they have was something far worse than that. They had the strong belief that if you just tear the old order down, that's enough. It doesn't matter what comes next, because the old order is so corrupt, it doesn't matter what comes after it. They don't have a plan. Now, Alistair Crook, in his latest article over Strategic Culture Foundation, which I will put a link to in the description of this podcast, talks about this very thing, and it's spooky that he and I are so on the same page about a lot of these things. I was floored when I read the article yesterday, because he talks about this exact thing, that the United States will not be able to win its civilizational war against the rest of the world because it is now fighting an internal war against itself, where the people who are arrayed against it internally just want to see it burn. They're worse than the Joker. The Joker described himself as a dog chasing a car. And he's like, I don't know what I'm going to do with the car once I get it, but that's what I want. I don't know what to do with the car if I actually get it. I just want the car. Bane is chasing the car to blow it up, secure in the belief that if he blows the car up, the world will be a better place. These people are nihilists. The Joker wasn't a nihilist. The Joker was broken and doesn't know how to deal with the real world. And he just believes that people will eat themselves if they're given any opportunity to turn on each other. And then he learns he's wrong, because Batman's given them some hope. Whereas Bane's goal is to break the people of their spirit, because he's a true believer. And they talk about it multiple times throughout the movie. All of Alfred's dialogue that's his job in the movie, is to elucidate for us what Bane actually is. And these people are nihilists. They are the villains. And Nolan doesn't humanize them in any way, manner, shape, or form, other than to tell their backstory. He doesn't justify them. He just explains what happened to them. They're still villains. And if you tear down the old order, this is a very important point, things will just be better, because nothing could be worse. And what they do is they then sell the cheap envy and unquenchable envy of Marxism as the false idol to worship after they break Batman and remove him from the scene and remove the cops from the scene and say, I'm giving Gotham back to you, the people. Do as you will. They neutralize the cops. They create an outlet for looting and put the insane in charge. They let out all the prisoners. The Scarecrow is just a sentencer. There's no trials. There's no rule of law. There's just rule of man. They let out all the criminals from Blackgate Prison because they were imprisoned on a lie, right? Just like this is where we are today, right? Does this sound familiar? This is exactly what's happening in the U.S. today. It's unbelievable the parallels within this movie and what's been happening in the United States over the last 6 to 8 weeks. Our social order is built on a lie, and it was the false narrative the state could save us from our own worst impulses. We've been living this lie, and the Marxists sold us this over the last 120 years, that we just need more social control. This is even worse. And the state ultimately suppresses creativity and choice, and the late stages of it protects the looters, the real looters, the John Daggetts, the George Soroses, the vandals, from the people. And it's why it's very easy for people like Bain or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or the rest of them to sell us the worst aspects of Marxism. They are true believers. Antifa, BLM, AOC, they're Bain. And the hapless oligarchs, like people like Soros and Nancy Pelosi and the rest of them, they're John Daggett. And they're going to be off at the first sign of the true believers getting real power. Remember, just before Daggett is killed, he looks at Bain, he's like, but I paid you a lot of money. Played by the brilliantly sniveling Ben Mendelsohn. I do think this gives you power over me. Do you feel powerful? And then he breaks his neck. Pivotal moment in the movie. The DNC does not understand what they've done, what they've unleashed in order to try and get Joe Biden into the presidency so that they can have their restoration. And I'm firmly convinced that they're going to try and bring Hillary Clinton back to us so they can have a Clinton restoration. That's what's going on here. So actually, Hillary Clinton is probably closer to John Daggett, while George Soros is actually Ra's al Ghul. Because he has a plan, that guy. And they don't care about anything other than their near-term goals. Daggett's case, take over Wayne Enterprises, consolidate some economic power in the defense industry or whatever, take over the military-industrial complex. What's Hillary Clinton's goal? First woman president. Restoration of the Clinton Foundation. Human trafficking or whatever else she's involved in, but nothing real. I don't think she may be a true believer in Marxism. She may be a Talia al Ghul style character, true believer, but I don't know that I believe that. The League of Shadows, under her father, Roz, they represent the Davos crowd. When I say the Davos crowd, go watch The Dark Knight Rises and you'll see the League of Shadows. Or Batman Begins and you'll see the League of Shadows. Their goal is to destroy the U.S., which is the proxy in the movie is Gotham City, and they are planning to substitute the EU and a stateless structure that exists over top of that, with the EU as the emanator of all new edicts because, well, they have a Politburo. They don't have a real Congress, and they don't have separation of powers and, actual potential for populist uprising against them. They have a plan, and they believe that their transnational regime, like Adrian Veidt's company in Watchmen, and Adrian Veidt's metastable narrative that he creates at the end of Watchmen, will be better under a uniform neo-feudal world with them at the top. That's what they're building. And this is ultimately what we're fighting against today. And it's ultimately why they're banning people like Stefan Molyneaux. Guess why? Because he's an obstacle. Molyneaux sees what's happening. Sargon of Akkad sees what's happening. People like Jordan Peterson see what's happening. I see what's happening. And those people have to be silenced. Trump is an obstacle. Brexit is an obstacle. They are expressions of populist revolt against their order. And they're trying to bring everybody into that moment of just righteous anger and let it explode. And then loot everybody and force everybody to wear masks. And the people who don't wear masks are the bad guys when we can go out and get them now. That's why they're going to make masks mandatory. It's why they want control over every aspect of what I call the wire. I'll link my original article about the wire into this podcast as well. The wire is all forms of communication. So the strategic aspects of our society, communication, information, money, roads, infrastructure, energy, that's the wire. What the mechanisms by which we transmit information to each other through the pricing system, that's the wire. They want control of it all. That's why they can't let the UK out, because they need to have as many people under the EU rubric as possible in order to be able to spread that like a Marxist cancer around the world. The true Soviet Union is in Brussels. Those other guys in Russia, they were tourists. And this is why I was ultimately wrong about Chris Nolan. He's telling us in The Dark Knight Rises that the heroes aren't Batman. Batman is the symbol. Batman can be anybody. It's what we do, as Tolkien put it, with the time that is given to us that matters. What are we going to do with the time that's afforded us right now to decide whether or not we're going to stop this or not, or how we're going to stop it, or if we can even stop it? Or should we just hunker down and try and survive it? That's why that whole sequence with the cops, after they're let out of their prison, they show back up to storm City Hall. And there's Matthew Modine's character, the symbol of the politicized cops, the corrupt cops who've been corrupted by politics and ego and hubris, show up to assault City Hall. And he shows up in his dress blues with his .45 in his hand against guys with AK-47s. That in and of itself is probably the most unbelievable thing in the entire movie, that those guys don't just get all mowed right down, that there's actual fist fight that occurs. No, AK-47s versus 45s. The AK-47 wins every single time. It's okay. It's a movie. And their assault on City Hall, when they do so, they're not members of the state anymore. Their uniforms now are meant more as them being defenders of the community, what the cops were supposed to be from the beginning. And they had been corrupted too. This is why Selena Kyle's conversion is also so important and why it's real and effective. She represents those people who were justifying their amorality because the system was amoral. I used to be one of those people. Watching her, I mean, even though Anne Hathaway usually does not affect me in any way, other than the fact that she's gorgeous, but she's kind of gorgeous in the same way that stained glass is. But she usually, I have really no emotional connection to Anne Hathaway in any role that she's ever been in. As a matter of fact, she's usually a blight on a movie, even though she's gorgeous. She was very good as Selena Kyle because that story is real. And Bruce's sacrifice truly moves her and is the metaphor for how we're going to get out of this. We have to wake up from our anger. We have to not lose our humanity in this process, even though we have every right to be angry with how we've been screwed over by this system. Everybody is right. Nolan's right. We've been screwed over by the system. What are you going to do about it? Losing your humanity is not the way. You may have to defend your property. You may have to pick up a gun and defend your property one day, but you don't have to do so in such a way that you lose your humanity, because it's our humanity that's going to get us out of this. Even though we're going to have to go through it because we can't go around it. We can't avoid it anymore. It's right here. It's in front of us. It's fascinating that Nolan told us all this 8 years ago, and I wasn't willing to listen then. I wanted to listen, but I really wanted to believe that he was a Marxist. I should have clued in that the Marxist film reviewers didn't much like The Dark Knight Rises, and therefore I should have liked it more than I did. Because usually that's what happens. When they don't like a complicated political movie, it's because they don't like the political message. And the political message was, y'all are vandals. I've gotten hipper since then. It's become really obvious to me since then. So artists get there first, guys. And he warned us that the only way out of this is through it, not by complaining about how unfair it is. And it's unfair that what happened to Stefan Molyneaux. There's no argument. But so what? What did you expect? You can't petition the crazies for mercy and sanity because they're crazy. They have no capacity for forgiveness, and they're insane. We're going to have to stand up. We're going to have to get harder, and we have to be ready to do what's necessary. Shoulders back, but with our humanity intact. And if we do that, we have a chance. And we have a chance to be the kind of heroes that Chris Nolan was talking about, as exemplified by Batman. All right, this has been the Gold Goats and Guns podcast, episode 41 for today, June 30th, 2020. If you like what you heard today, give a like, give a subscribe, share it with your friends, do whatever you have to do. You guys be well. You take care. We'll talk soon. We'll talk next Tuesday. Keep your stick on, guys.